Good morning, everybody. My name is Jack Palmer. I am a 1L at the St. Thomas School of Law and a member of the Murphy Scholar Program, which is part of the Murphy Institute. The Murphy Institute at St. Thomas is a program which encourages a dynamic blend of Catholic thought and teachings alongside political thought and law within the context of a university. We promote a variety of talks and speaker opportunities, which assist with furthering the understanding of others within the Catholic community, as well as broadening the expertise of students within the realm and thought of, well, the Catholic Church. Today, we are welcoming Dr. Hittinger. Before we proceed with the talk, I think just to establish a few things just before things start is that we will end the program with a Q&A. At the bottom of the bar on your screen, you can see a little Q&A function. If you have any questions, you are allowed to submit them through the Q&A function, and we can address them at the end. And furthermore, the program is being recorded and will be available on the Murphy Institute website after the event. So, once again, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Hittinger, an esteemed scholar of Catholic political and social thought. With a career spanning over 3 decades, Dr. Hittinger has held various teaching positions at distinguished universities, such as the University of Chicago, Princeton University, and New York University, among others. Dr. Hittinger has made significant contributions to the field of Catholic social and political thought, and is recognized as a leading scholar in this area. He is a member of the Pontifical Academy of St. Thomas Aquinas and was appointed as an ordinarius in the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences by Pope Benedict XVI in 2009. Currently, he is a fellow at the Catholic University of America's Institute for Human Ecology and serves as the inaugural co-director of the program in Catholic political thought. Dr. Hittinger's accomplishments and expertise make him an excellent speaker and an invaluable asset to our event today, and we are pleased to bring him back to St. Thomas to speak on the subject of eschatology and political thought. Dr. Hittinger.
Thank you, Jack, and thanks also to the Murphy Institute. It's always good to be back, even if it's by Zoom. Sometimes I take my colleagues and students by surprise when I assert that Joseph Ratzinger is the most important Catholic political thinker of his generation, basically of the late 20th century and the early 21st century. Of course, Joseph Ratzinger is usually identified with theology, that is Christology, eschatology, scripture, patristics, but he was deeply versed also in history, philosophy, cultural history. And I think in his own autobiographical sense, his interest in the political is right there at the beginning because, of course, he was a teenager under the Third Reich, was actually drafted into the army for a while. So his earliest experience of being a young man is having to confront the issue of World War II. And then when he goes to seminary afterwards, he is having to be like many other German youth who were in universities, having to deal with the rebuilding of Germany and Western Europe after the war. This picks up speed during the 60s. By now, he's a real working scholar and was a peritus at Vatican II, and worked considerably on the conversations and drafts of documents having to do with the church in the modern world, that is, with issues of culture, history, politics, and so forth. Of course, in the early 1980s, he's made prefect of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith by John Paul II, and then spends, 25 years, almost every day, dealing with issues of liberation theology, the morally nihilistic politics of secular culture, with biomedical issues. So Ratzinger was no rookie at all. In fact, he was quite experienced in questions of political thought. And you can simply go to St. Ignatius Press and look in any of their bibliographies of Ratzinger-Pope Benedict. You'll see that at least 50% of the publications fall into the category of political. So let me get right to the thesis. Ratzinger's thesis was this, that Western culture inherits two logos traditions, Christianity and its cousin, that is, that of ancient philosophy, the search for wisdom. And both of these logos traditions are distinct from the power of politics, quite distinct in different ways. The divine logos, which is Christ himself, become flesh, died for our sins, is in a completely different category than the search for wisdom, which is basically based on human nature and natural law. But both of these powers are higher than the state. And for that thesis, you need to read Spe Salvi, his encyclical. He says, in ancient depictions of Jesus, one finds two staffs, let's say the staff and a crozier. On one hand, you see Jesus depicted as having the philosopher's staff, a kind of walking stick, which represents in the natural order the quest for wisdom and living well, okay? This is quite distinct from Caesar. These are not the facies of power. This is the quest for, and a natural quest, for wisdom and truth. Truth, which is what Pontius Pilate claimed he didn't have an adequate definition of. On the other hand, we see Jesus also holding the shepherd's staff, right? Because the other logos is not just what we are searching for, but a logos who in the flesh becomes man and searches for us. And this is a supernatural incorporation. Ratzinger's thesis was this: in our time, both of these understandings of the logos, the quest for something higher than just ordinary political order and culture, have been capsized. I'm using his own term, just capsized. They're upside down. And both are undergoing a legitimation crisis. I'm again using his own terms. So this produces that when the quest for wisdom, the natural quest for wisdom of human beings as rational animals, when that's turned upside down, human beings are left only with, to use Aristotelian terms, material and efficient causality. The only nature that remains is not our rational nature, our souls, but rather our bodies and mechanisms. All form and finality must come from human authority. So human authority simply replaces that of nature in the quest for wisdom. The eschatological crisis is, to put it bluntly, is that contemporary human culture has come to think of Jesus without divinity. That is, Jesus is an historical character within the immanent flow of human history who gives us inspiration, but we humans make ourselves to be, by technology and politics, what we must become rather than the origins in the logos of nature or that of grace. The upshot of this crisis is that nothing is left standing except politics. It replaces both nature and grace. And I want to give two examples from his speeches and writings. There are many, but I'm just going to pick these two. The first is a speech that he gave at the University of Cambridge, England, in 1988. He is still prefect for the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith at this point. And he came to England to give the Fisher lecture from St. John Fisher for the Catholic chaplaincy there. And the title of his paper was Consumer Materialism and Christian Hope, which the title sort of suggested that he had come to speak about problems like drugs, AIDS, terrorism, just the kind of things that an important person would make a speech about in an important public gathering. But very quickly, it became clear that Cardinal Ratzinger had not come to give that kind of speech. Rather, he came to give a speech about the problem of the quest for wisdom, that is, our natural quest for the Logos, that we share by a kind of participation, and that we want to know, even from afar, as first truth. And he begins by saying this: what was first to all of pre-modern humankind lies in the conviction, I'm quoting, that in man's being there lies an imperative, the conviction that man does not devise morality itself by calculating expediencies, but comes upon it in the being of things. And indeed, it turned out that Cardinal Ratzinger had come to give a lecture on natural law. And he put the question of evidence just right up front. What is our evidence for morals? Right? And he began lecturing on C.S. Lewis, C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man, published during World War II, 1943, that had that appendix on the universal moral propositions modeled on the Chinese Tao. They're basically precepts of natural law, and how they're found commonly across all cultures. So what do these wisdom traditions have in common? That the touchstone of moral truth lies in the being of things, not in our laws and policies and contrivances, technological contrivances. And he says, morality is not man's prison. It is rather the divine. That even by nature, we are open to reality as a whole, right? If this were not true, then the order of nature would just be an aggregation of details that don't amount to something more than themselves. And if that were true, then morality would be our prison, right? That what is divine in man would demand to be emancipated from our usual moral propositions. So he says that that kind of morality has lost its evidence. So the modern age, he proposes, is marked by a shift away from what is true to what can be done or made, right? A few years later, actually, he had a very important public exchange with the European philosopher Jürgen Habermas. And he said this, which was, I think, modeled and taken from his Cambridge lecture. Ratzinger said, the natural law has remained, especially in the Catholic Church, a key issue in dialogues with secular society and with other communities of faith in order to appeal to the reason we share in common and to seek a basis for a consensus about the ethical principles of law in a secular pluralistic society. He says, but this idea of natural law presupposed a concept of nature in which nature and reason overlap, because nature itself, in its origin in the first logos, is rational. But he says, this view of nature has capsized. And what view of nature is that? We can just give a little 3-sentence aphorism of the Stoic philosopher Epictetus. Quote, "Were I a swan, I should do after the manner of a swan. But now, since I am a rational being, I must sing to God, and that is my work. I do it, and nor will I desert my way or my post, as long as it's granted to me to hold it. And upon you too, I call upon you to join in this same hymn." That's what Ratzinger means by the Logos tradition, that is the wellspring of morals, and it's by nature because of our rationality. But in the modern position, we can only deal with what Charles Taylor calls closed world structures. And closed world structures are of 3 sorts. They're material structures, they're mechanistic structures, and there is pure freedom within the immanent world. And therefore, there's nothing but sheer man, matter, mechanism, and pure freedom. And on this basis, traditional morality would be regarded as a prison. And there is no way out of it on modern terms, but to find the command, the ought that we can share, except by the unilateral projection of politics. We can do that privately within ourselves, but what holds for all of us has to be created from scratch through the political order of things, based upon matter, expediency, and freedom. So putting that quest for the Logos, which is the moral foundation, the natural law foundation of our dignity and the human project in a way. We have one other Logos, and this one is strictly theological, and we call it eschatology. And we could say that Ratzinger's concern is that modern eschatology by Protestant and indeed some Catholic theologians is basically Jesus without divinity. In his book on eschatology, 1988, by the way, the same time that he was just about to become prefect of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, he writes that the historical Jesus in modern theological literature inspires us only to guide the imminent historical flow of things. And he's speaking of Moltmann theology of hope. He's thinking of different social gospel movements. And of course, he's thinking of the liberation theologians, or at least some of them. And he says, our entire confession of faith is brought under a single theme of hope, that is, of historical evolution. Things are getting better all the time. So one cheer for Jesus, who gives us some inspiration, but 2 cheers for human management of progress. And so the kingdom of God, the entrance into the eschatological kingdom by grace, is simply transferred over to a terrene earthly world of indefinite progress. Now, in the eschatological, by the way, by eschatology here, we don't mean merely what Catholics call the 4 last things: death, judgment, heaven, and hell. Eschatology has a broader meaning, is that when that which is last is made present, right? But what is made present in the mission of Jesus Christ and his apostles and the shepherds of the church is to adhere to the kingdom in the person of Christ himself. In other words, if we ask what the kingdom is, it's already happened. It's Christ. Christ made flesh, crucified, resurrected from the dead. And those who are its inhabitants are those who draw near to him by grace. And Ratzinger says, the message of the kingdom of God has something very important to say to politics. It's healthy for the political order that its own content is not eschatological. The setting asunder, he says, of eschatology and politics is one of the fundamental tasks of Christian theology and of the kingdom, to note the difference between the philosopher's staff guiding politics and the shepherd's staff of the kingdom. Eschatology is focused on the true temple, the basilius, which is also can mean the kingdom, the regnum, and it is Christ. The kingdom is nothing other than Christ and those who draw near to him. So we are brought into the kingdom. The kingdom is made present to us by faith. And this is the sign of Jonah. For Christ's teaching converges on himself as the now of God. So under the best conditions, the eschatological staff is the Logos coming here and becoming flesh and incorporating us through faith that works by love. And it doesn't interrupt the political. As Jesus said to Pilate, my kingdom is not of this world. It doesn't interrupt the political, nor does it interrupt the natural Logos and quest for first truth. Rather, it protects the political. It protects the political because it shows that the political doesn't have to be everything. And it allows the political to have its own identity as a framework of action in which we achieve natural perfections. If all goes well, we achieve natural perfections. And it allows the political to at least have a glimpse of things higher than itself. The first glimpse by nature is that there's a pursuit of truth that's not political. It may have political consequences, but it itself is not political because it's not proxies. It's not either proxies, nor is it an art. It's a quest for wisdom. That's higher than the political. All of the ancient thinkers, or most of the ancient thinkers, held this position. Plato certainly did, Aristotle did, the Stoics did, many others. That's higher than the political, that quest. You can even think of that first paragraph of Augustine's Confessions. We are by nature restless for first truth, for God. So it helps the political find its place in both of those senses. But he says what has happened is that the eschatological tends to be reduced to the imminent flow of history, to making the world a better place. And which means, unless you add something more to this picture, it means that the eschatological is the political. That is, the eschatological becomes the ever new inventions and processes and realizations of history, of an historical quest. So what has happened, he believes, is that we have both the philosophical quest for first truth and the eschatological quest to be one with the Logos through grace. Both of them have their paths have been reduced to, well, you could say private judgment, but it never merely ends with private judgment. Not even liberalism ends with mere private judgment. It ends with a policy decision of whose private judgments and which private judgments are going to prevail and to be enforced. In other words, the political, rather than being fecundated in some way by the quest for first truth, the Logos tradition, or by grace, is totally autobasilius. It is the regnum, the kingdom. All enforceable things in human life begin and end with the political. And that's the crisis. Even his last encyclical, published in 2013 by Pope Francis on faith, Lumen Fidei, makes a beeline for this problem. And in the difference, to summarize, the difference between the traditional Logos quest for first truth, which can fecundate polity, but it's not the same thing. It's a different kind of act. And the truly eschatological notion of Christ. Here's the difference. In the quest for first truth, we search out God. We are on a search for the divine. As close as we can get to first truth. But in what Ratzinger means by the eschatological is that the divine seeks us. That's the shepherd's staff, coming in search for the lost sheep. The divine enters our life and searches us out and finds us even in death. So that metaphysical, religious, theological framework of the two notions of Logos is what he says is capsized in our culture, which doesn't mean that no one believes it, but it is something that will have to be recovered if, even for the practical purposes of limiting the power of the political. All other limits on the power of the political are just other uses of force that will eventually become politicized anyway. So on that note, Jack, I probably said enough. I've spoken for half an hour, more or less. I'm sure there are many questions.
Yeah, so if anybody, thank you for the talk, by the way, Dr. Hittinger, that was very informative. Yeah, so if anybody has any questions, feel free to just pop them in chat and I can just ask them for you. I suppose my question is, and you kind of touched on it in the beginning and kind of near the tail end of the talk, is eschatology as it pertains to Catholics, is there's this focus on the Basilius, as you put it, which is helping, guide Christ, or well, rather Christ guiding us towards him. I was wondering if you kind of see, the kind of polity and the politics of the modern age, if you see them kind of trying to emulate that in a almost perverse way, kind of trying to bring the divine down to man instead of man up to the divine. If you see that at all, or if that's not really just part of the goal of the modern age anyways, it's just pure secularism and atomism.
actually, Ratzinger has a lot to say about that very problem in the ancient world, because, well, especially the ancient Roman world. He has written quite a lot about this because he was a student of St. Augustine and who had plenty to say about the problem of the Roman Imperium. But in the ancient world, the divine, in one sense, really is the political power. Under some vaguely spiritual auspices, Jupiter maybe, or some other, but the state or the polity is divine. And that's why all public religion, putting private religion to one side, truly public religion is supervised by the city. Because the gods that belong to the city are not matters of private choice. They're not matters of voodoo or anything like that. They are the protectors of the city. And they might even be the highest part of the city. And this is why Caesar becomes divine, right? Caesar becomes a divus, a god. Okay, so the Christian argument against that understanding of things was, it's right in the Gospels, but it was almost immediately. I think you especially want to read Letter to Dionysius, a late 2nd century apologetical letter, but certainly Augustine. So the Christianity coming into the world reestablishes what we could call the boundary between the human and the divine without losing the human quest by creation to know first truth. And of course, Ratzinger argues along with Augustine, most of the philosophers knew that this was true. Even before Christianity, they knew it was true. And thus, St. Paul on Mars Hill, and he lectures to the Athenians or preaches to the Athenians, and he congratulates them because he saw a tomb to the unknown God and said, that's the beginning of wisdom.
Interesting. Thank you for your response. I appreciate that. I have one more question kind of going off of that. And if anybody has questions, again, feel free to put them in chat. You talked about the divine being political. My question is, and this is something I've kind of noticed, is that it seems like sometimes, especially in America, we see and maybe this is a bit of a hot take, but sometimes we see certain people approach the Bill of Rights less as being something supplemental to a divine understanding of morality, and almost like a civil religion. I was kind of wondering, does Ratzinger have anything to talk about that? Obviously we've already talked about the lines between politics and the divine being muddled in a way that's not beneficial to Christendom and grace, but does he talk about that, just kind of deifying the law?
Ratzinger's very clear on this, that one of the things that makes Christianity as a world religion unique is that it really does believe in natural law and that we are governed by God in the first place through our nature. And therefore, Christianity gives homage to the wisdom traditions more than to state religion. So we remember, well, it's especially in Matthew, who finds Jesus? Two.
Are you asking me, or?
Yeah, I'm asking you,
Oh.
just so we can get the conversation going.
Who finds
Who
Jesus?
finds Jesus in the stable?
Oh man, like I'm blanking.
Okay, first they're shepherds.
Well, yeah, the shepherds and then the wise men.
Okay, yes, the humble are taught And then the Magi, the wise, who followed the star not through magic, but through astronomicals, quasi-scientific.
Mhm.
So both sides come together. The humble, this is almost like the foundation for a Magnificat, the humble see. And so do the wise who have been searching for first truth. And the star stops over top of Bethlehem, signifying that however wise you might be, it subserves whatever is happening in that stable. By the way, this is standard patristical exegesis, but that's where we can come to it through a path of just kind of humility, even natural humility. We can come to it through wisdom, right? But of course, what is established is a new regime, which contradicts neither.
Interesting. Interesting. Just have one question coming in from just from the Murphy Institute. For those who are interested in these sorts of topics, what would you recommend as some essential readings or resources to get started on?
Okay. Well, do you mean in Pope Benedict XVI?
Sure. Let's
Well,
start from there.
okay, let's begin with there. You want to read, this is almost all of this is online or in a paperback book. You want to read that Cambridge lecture on C.S. Lewis. That's right online. You'll have no problem finding it. You do want to read the collection that comes out in English called Truth and Tolerance, which have several essays on this problem of what happens to our moral order when we no longer have moral evidence and all we have is just power. I mean, managerial power, all kinds of power, but what happens? And this also has a very nice section on Augustine. I highly recommend something that came out, also Ignatius, Faith and Politics, a collection of his essays on some of the topics I just covered, but especially the chapter Politics and Truth, Jesus before Pilate, and Augustine's confrontation with the political theology of Rome. These are just super duper Ratzingerian essays from which you can learn quite a lot. I also recommend, of course, the different volumes of Jesus of Nazareth, especially Pope Benedict's coverage of the temptations of Christ. He has a lot to say in that regard. By the way, here's something that John Paul II and Benedict had in common. We talk about a loss of two different things that are crucial. One is the natural quest for the Logos, first truth, which is the foundation of ethics. And the second is the autobasilius of Christ, the truly eschatological event. And Gaudium et Spes, which both of them worked on. Of course, Wojtyła worked on it more seriously than Ratzinger, but there are two formulations of this problem that are right in Gaudium et Spes. When the creator is forgotten, man himself disappears. That's pointing out the problem about the first Logos, when we no longer have any confidence in our actions to know truth. The first Logos, the truth of participating in some kind of creative act. Okay. The second formulation is Christ reveals man to himself, which is tracking the second notion of Logos. That's right in Gaudium et Spes. So my all too brief talk trying to bring these things together, these two different understandings of participation in the Logos, which are now forgotten, in many ways publicly obliterated anymore, that this insight about modern life is of that generation of Vatican II. It's of the generation of people who were born in the 30s and the 40s, who come of age either in the mid to late 50s or in the 60s. But Vatican II already contains these insights. So there are many other people that need to be read and in light of this as well. So, including Wojtyła.
Yeah, that's quite the reading list. Thank you very much. That's certainly a lot to go off of. We have a question from Raphael. In your opinion, what would be the contribution of Pope Benedict XVI on natural law for the present time?
Well, I think he made two contributions, one theoretical and one practical. His practical contributions can be found all over the place because, and all of those issues leading up to Veritatis Splendor, Splendor of Truth, which is the first encyclical ever by a pope on morality itself, just morality directly, and its sources and its actions and so forth. Benedict really had a hand in that, and the reason he did was because at that time they were treating many of the problem areas over at the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And a lot of stuff was going on biomedical. So if you go to the Vatican website and click whatever it's called today, it's no longer called Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, but you'll see it immediately. And you go to the thing and click publications. You'll see how many there were, especially during the time that Cardinal Ratzinger was in charge. I swear, half of all of the issues were moral. By the way, the other half were Christological, which brings us back to the two notions of logos. So so many of the formulations that you'll find in Veritatis Splendor have Cardinal Ratzinger's hand in it. But I think his main theological, philosophical move was this effort formed in all of the debate with secularists and non-believers in Western Europe over those decades, to hold out as a place we can dialogue the natural law tradition as the quest for wisdom or participation in wisdom. He even got Habermas to kind of go not into the end zone, but at least up to the 20-yard line on this one, that this is essential to the dignity of human beings, this quest, and that the quest itself teaches us that whatever the political is, it's not just force. It's something that makes room for and supports the quest for truth. And I think to take natural law, therefore, even theoretically, and put it back into a more, I would call it, traditional context that even the Stoics could have understood, or anyone, is great because it comes with a narrative. It comes with the Magi. I mean, that's our link. And I think it was in many places very well received. In other words, not natural law just as a metaphysical issue, but as a quest. And it was Ratzinger who ordered the International Theological Commission to write its kind of famous document called In Search of a Universal Ethic, which takes this tact as well. That's Ratzinger's doing. So he has a lot more to do with these kind of political, cultural, moral, legal issues of our time than most people might think.
Interesting. All right. Yeah, I think I can speak for everyone when I say that this is definitely a very cerebral topic. Definitely not something that they would cover in Sunday school, but thank you very much for your time. I think this was very interesting, and your insight was very much appreciated.
But if it wasn't Sunday school, it wasn't Twitter either.
You got me there. You got me there. Yeah, I think yeah, so that's kind of all we have for Q&A. Yeah, do you have any kind of closing remarks, or are we good?
Yeah, read his last encyclical that Francis published.
All right.
Right.
Sounds good. Thank you again for your time, Dr. Hittinger. It's been a pleasure. And thank you so much for being here with the Murphy Institute.
Thank you.
Absolutely. All right. And that concludes the talk for today. Thank you all for coming, and feel free to come to more of these Zoom webinars and these Zoom talks. We greatly appreciate having you all here and for your contributions.